Hello everyone, welcome to GreenVest Makerspace. My name is Mac, and today we're going to be making a leather card holder that has a custom 3D printed stamp there in the corner. Looks like that. There are free plans in the description below. Stick around, let's have some fun. All right, here is an example of what we're going to be making, a leather card holder. So this back piece here is represented by this rectangular shape. And we have two front pieces represented by this shape here. It's not going to be the mountain shape and just a flat piece. It's going to have a triangular cutout that'll help us or make it easier for us to pull the cards out. And we'll do that on each side. So we'll have two of these, one of these, and we'll cut out each of these individually. And we're going to be using this veg tan leather that is roughly 3 millimeters thick. Doesn't necessarily have to be that thick. It's kind of up to whatever you have on hand, whatever your preferences are. But yeah, these things age really well. I've had this for about 10 years now, and as you can see, we've worn some things into it. It's got a nice patina. It folds nicely. It holds probably a dozen to 15 cards, and it's just been really handy. So yeah, let's get to it. These drawings are all to scale, so all you have to do is punch holes in each corner, and we'll put it on the leather, and then we'll trace it out, cut it out, and we'll put it all together. So these pieces are essentially, they add thickness so that we can actually hold cards there. So that is just, there's a strip of leather. There's 3 layers, the top layer, the bottom layer, and then one of the strips in the middle to allow a little bit more room for all these cards. So that's what those strips are for. So we have our 4 different shapes here. We'll bring our leather in. We'll start with the biggest one, the back piece. See, there's a bit of an imperfection there. I'll try to avoid that as best I can. This is just a scratch-all, pretty cheap on Amazon. Good for scratching, scoring the leather, making holes, and that's what we'll use to punch holes in each of the corners. So hold this down nicely. Just put some firm pressure on the scratch-all. It should make a nice permanent imprint into the leather that we can then make a straight line, connecting the dots. So there's the back piece. Since we're on a roll here, I'll find spaces for 2 of these, maybe right there, right there. Then we'll do the same for the strips. So not only do you mark these 4 corners, you will also mark the corners of the V cutout. All right, there's one face. Do the same right next to it. Okay, so there are the 2 faces. Now we'll make 4 of these and 2 of these. So the long ones go on the bottoms, and the shorter ones go along the sides. Sometimes it can be tricky to connect the dots that you're supposed to be connecting. I've made that mistake before. So just be careful that you're connecting the correct dots since they're so close together. Get a smaller ruler for this. There are the two long ones. And the four short. All right, lovely. So we got all our pieces. Now you take a box cutter that has a very sharp blade, because leather's pretty tough, and we'll cut out each of these pieces. To do multiple passes, you don't have to break through the full width of the leather in one stroke of the blade. Feel free to take multiple passes. The important thing is that your ruler stays straight on the line that you intend it to go down, as opposed to, halfway down the line you kind of cockeye it like that. You want to make sure you're cutting one straight line. And take that whole row off. Swap this blade out. There we go. All right, get that out of the way. Brokeman rule. Hold that ruler down nice and firm. All right, there's your rectangle. We'll cut straight across that line and then do the V cutouts after. Okay, now I'm not even going to use a ruler for this, so just be careful. Follow the line that you made. Kind of get straight up and down over it to see that you're following the line. Go slow. Kind of punch the nose of your blade down into the leather to make sure you really get to the very end of the V. Punch down. That corner should come out nicely. Oh, a little bit more. There we go. Boom. All right, those pieces down. Let's move on to the strips. Okay, now we won't use the straight edge to cut across the short lengths of the strips. We'll just kind of eyeball it. All right, now the next step, after all of the pieces have been cut to size, is to add a bit of personalization. So I have a 3D printer, so what I've done in the past is I've added things like initials or logos or random other objects. Like this is a tree ring that I 3D printed and then stamped into leather. This says cheers. This is a hop leaf. Here's some names and letters. Here's a rose. What I'm going to do today is just kind of for no other reason than I liked the design, but there's a little rhino that I found on the internet. What we're going to do is we're going to case the leather, we're going to get it wet, and then we're going to imprint the design. So I actually did the test. So there's the logo. And that's what it looked like. I actually pushed down too hard. This was the first time I did it, and I ended up smashing the poor rhino because I pressed down too hard with the press. But then I printed it again. One of the benefits of 3D printing is you can just make the object again like that. Kind of up to each individual as to where they want to put it, but that's what I'm going to do. So as far as casing the leather, that essentially just means to get it wet, and that makes it a little bit more pliable. So like you can kind of see the difference. This is not cased. This over here is cased about 30 minutes ago, so it's mostly dry. But you get it wet, it's a little bit more pliable, and then any imprint that you make into it is going to be permanent. So when you do get the leather wet, make sure that you don't, for example, push down too hard with your fingernails. Otherwise, you're going to leave a permanent imprint where you don't want to otherwise. So yeah, get a little thing of water here. This is a dauber. You could also use a sponge, just as easy. And not only am I going to case the piece where I'm going to do the imprinting, I'm also going to get these out of here because they're not going to be visible. But I'm also going to do this piece and this piece. Yeah, when you're casing your objects, and if you choose to dye them, make sure that they're all cased evenly. Otherwise, things might get a little uneven color-wise. Leather is very absorbent. Sponge might actually have been a better tool with the size of this piece. Some parts of the leather, as you can see here, will accept water at different rates than others, which is fine. I've put enough water into it so that it's about half the thickness through the leather, and then that's when I make my imprint. Let's go back to this one. So I'm just going to put it in the bottom right here. Here's a look at how much the water is soaked into the leather. This one looks a little bit better, actually, a little bit more soaked in. So I'll just kind of eyeball it. There's going to be a stitching line down here, right there, and also down here. So I might want to put it further out to avoid that stitching line, maybe something like that. And because I did a test press, I know not to press too hard, otherwise I might smash the poor guy. I think that looks pretty good. So that's a start. That looks pretty cool. Not bad. Honestly, I might not want to push my luck. I kind of like how it is, but I'll give it one more go. I like it. All right, with the leather still wet from the casing, now I'm going to put some oil-based stain on these pieces. And in my experience, it is best to apply oil-based stain when the leather is still a little bit wet. If it's completely dry, it has a tendency to accept the dye slightly differently. It's just easier to get even coats if the leather is still wet. So I'll use this same tool, this dauber, that I use to wet the leather. I'll use it to apply this dye from Phoebing's. There's a whole bunch of different options, oil or water-based stain for leathers. I've always used Phoebing's. There are other videos out there that definitely explain the pros and cons better than I can, so that's a whole different topic. But I'm going to use this stuff because I have it. I'm going to apply it to this on these sides. I won't apply it to this side and this side because these are going to be completely hidden, but there will be a strip in the middle here that I will dye as well. because it will be exposed. So I'll probably go down yay far on either side, just so this portion matches everything else. And I won't bother about staining these because they're going to be hidden underneath. So I'm going to take this stuff outside because it's a little stinky, and I'll show you how it's done. All right, now that we have stained our pieces, it's time to do a little gluing. And what I'm going to use is this stuff called Leather Weld from EcoFlow. It very much reminds me of Elmer's white glue, and honestly, I don't know the difference between the two. They might just be rebranding it. In any case, you could also use a product that's generically called contact cement. That's a little bit stronger, I'd say, but it's also way stinkier and just smells very toxic, whereas this does not smell at all. So I'm going to use this stuff, but before I do, I'm going to mark the locations of where the glue needs to go. Kind of just laid these spacers out here. These pieces are going to go on top eventually. But we need to know exactly where to place the glue, so I'll make a light line with the scratch all up there that will eventually be covered up by the spacer, but just so we know where to stop gluing. And what I like to do is score each surface that's going to get glued to one another to help the glue adhere to the leather or the layers of leather. So just do one of these, kind of rips up the fibers. It's similar to scoring clay before you stick two pieces of clay together. But yeah, we can do this to both sides of the spacers because this is going to get sandwiched in between both this and that. You don't have to go crazy. Just bring those fibers up a little bit to help with the adhesion. It's probably good for that one. We'll do the same to these surfaces. All right, that looks good to me. So I'll apply glue to both surfaces, and then we'll let it sit and dry. We'll clamp it and let it sit and dry until we run out of clamps. So I will go like this. Have a paper towel handy. Fortunately, I don't. And just carefully put them down. It's okay if there's a couple gaps. That's not a big deal. You're not going to see that anyway. Just do one of these. Actually, you know what? Kind of scrape out the squeeze out. Just make sure each face of the leather is flush, or the ends are flush with one another. Because the quality of those two connecting, and what will eventually be the third, will determine the quality of your resulting edge. And that's all the clamps I've got. So we'll sit and let that dry, and then we'll do this side, and then we'll continue on. All right, 1 hour later, remove these clamps and do the other side. All right, another hour later. Now we'll add these faces on. Get a sense for what it's going to look like. But similar to what we did here, we'll score the glue lines. All right, with our glue all dry, now it's time to move on to stitching prep. So we can check our work so far after gluing. Yeah, we'll eventually end up cleaning up these rough, sharp, glued edges later. But it looks pretty good. Things are about where we want them. So to prep for stitching, here are the various tools you can use. This here is a stitch groover, so this thing can be adjusted in and out depending on where you want the stitch line to be. But basically, you set this where you want the stitch line to go. You ride the front of that against the edge of the leather, and then this knife piece there scores a groove down the line of the stitch. So I'll do one of these, one of these, one of these on each side. And I'll probably go for halfway across the width of the spacer. So I'll set that about yay far and then make the grooves. So once we have the grooves, we know where the stitches are going to go. That's our stitch line. And then we will use these punches to pre-punch the holes for where our stitches are going to go. And we'll punch these in with this mallet. This tool here we're actually not going to use, but let's say you only had an individual prong stitch puncher. So this wheel, you run down the stitch line and it makes indentations at each location where an individual stitch would go. So it basically ensures that your stitches are evenly spaced if you're doing an individual punch. But we're not going to use that. We're going to use a 4-prong most likely, and I'll show you how that's done once it comes time to do that. So for now, I'll set those aside, set my stitch groover here accordingly. Let's try that. I can move it over a little. Okay, I like it. This is another one of those tools where you don't need to go to the full depth on the first pass. You can take multiple passes. But as you're doing this, be careful around the corners. Be careful not to strike all the way down the full length, because remember, you're gonna want to find that edge prior to it as you turn this thing 90 degrees and do a line down this way. So just watch how I do this. So I won't start from the very top because we'll end our stitch just shy of the very top. So let's make sure I actually like that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Stop short. I typically stop way short just to make sure that I don't screw it up. See, we're gonna have to connect these. This not only acts as a visual representation of where the stitches are going to go, but it actually, if you go down deep enough, it actually allows the stitches to sit in a little groove that essentially makes the top of the stitches either flush or below flush the top of the leather, basically protecting the stitches and hopefully making them last longer. but it's also very nice to have a nice straight stitch line to follow as you're punching the holes. How about that? These fun little curly cues. Now I'll go over it again, going a little deeper. Okay, I think that's pretty good. We'll do the same to the other side. All right. And in a perfect world, I think I would do the same on this side. And I've actually tried that because, of course, your stitches are going to show on both sides. But if I were to use this same distance setting on this side, because there might be slight imperfections in where this edge is relative to this edge, this straight line might not be exactly on top of or below this straight line, and also as you're punching these holes, if you're not completely straight up and down, the holes might end up not where the line is. So I typically just leave the back end of the stitch, i.e. this side, without the stitch groove and just live with it. It really helps to have a firm, solid surface. It's not plywood as you're doing this hole punching. Otherwise, you're going to have to hit way harder than you need to because the surface is going to absorb a lot of the blow. Whereas if you have this nice hard marble slab, it should punch pretty easy. And this is just so my prongs don't go straight into the marble. There's some wood there. So, all right. So what I'll do here is I'll start here and then work my way around to there. Try to get you a better view here. And once in a while, just look on the other side to see if you've made it all the way through. Prongs. And then you don't need to set your whole set of prongs an even distance away from the holes that you just made. Kind of guesstimate. You don't have to do that. You can just put your end prong in the last hole that you just made and carry on nice and evenly spaced. So go from there to there and then go on down the line. Over at the corner, and actually that might be perfect. No, that might be too far. I'll go one. I'll put one fresh punch in, reusing 3 of the holes. Put one fresh punch in. Turn the card holder 90 degrees, and then just start a brand new row. There's not a hole at the very corner. I'll go like that and start a fresh row. There's one side done. All right, time for some stitching. So we're going to do what is called the saddle stitch, and we're going to use these 2-inch stitching needles from Tandy Leather. The wax thread comes in various different weights and colors, as you can see here. I'll find a link in the description for the waxed thread that I get, but you definitely want to use wax. It just helps protect the thread. So we're going to do 2 stitching runs. One there, and the other there. So to prep your needle, Zzz. I guess I'll choose the thread that I want first. I'll try this one for no particular reason other than I think it might go good with this brown. I'll get a good long stretch of it, longer than you think you need, just to make sure that you don't run out in the middle of your stitching run. This is probably a 6 foot length, just for that much, which is likely overkill. You want to have too much rather than too little. Here are my two ends. Here are my needles. They can be stubborn. So thread it through there. And take the pointy end with maybe 3 or so inches remaining. Take the pointy end and jam it through the center of the thread. Like so. And then simply pull the tail over the end like that, and then kind of cinch it up. And don't rip it tight, otherwise it might end up breaking down there. So pinch it like that, and you're good to go. So that's one end. Let's do it again on the other end. Through the eye. Give yourself about 3 inches. Take the pointy end, jam it through the center. There we go. So it looks like that. Take the tail, bring it up, cinch it down closer to the end of the needle, and take 2 fingers and just swipe across it like that. You are ready to go. All right, the saddle stitch. This thing is resting in what is called a stitching pony. It's essentially a third hand. It looks like this. You sit on it and it grips your leather work as you're stitching. You certainly don't need one of these, but it makes your life a lot easier. I'll put a link in the description. But I wouldn't recommend it if you're just getting started out. I'd say just do it the hard way as you get used to the technique. You could also make one, which could be a fun project, but in any case, this is the saddle stitch. So take your 2 leather ends and we'll start right there. We'll go down and around. Right there, down and around. Let me tighten this back up. So starting right there, poke one of your needles through the first hole. So now you've got 2 needles, 1 in each hand. Even it out so there's an even amount of whatever this stuff is called, string, on either end. And then I'm right hand dominant, so I'll start with my right hand, but take the needle in your right hand, push it through the next hole. Bring it all the way through. And then take the needle that hasn't gone through the second hole and now put it through the second hole, trying to avoid that thread that you just pushed through from the other side. Sometimes this thicker part of the needle gets stuck in the middle of the leather, which can be kind of challenging, but just use some strength and it'll pull right out. And then cinch that up. And that right there is your first stitch. Now just do that 150 more times. Let's try it again. One end through. Boom. Cinch it up. I'll give you a couple different angles too, so to help you out. And then once you get into a groove, it's actually kind of relaxing. Kind of enter a flow state with it. At least I do. Essentially, there's another way of looking at it. Before I pull that all the way through, it's kind of just like a bow. Sometimes it helps to have some pliers around. All right, we have arrived at the last stitch. So you may be wondering, what happens next? Well, let's see, we've got one more hole there that doesn't have any thread in it. We'll go through that one, just like we've been doing. Now our string is only that long. Just like it's another stitch, go through it with both needles. And all we do is just backstitch. It's called backstitching. So basically just do the same thing in the other direction. So now we're at the end. Put one needle through the hole that now already has a layer of thread in it, and just simply do it again. It can be a little bit more challenging because now there's already a layer of thread in there, so there's less space for a new layer of thread to go in, but that's what your pliers are for. It's pretty stiff. And do that, I don't know, 2 or 3 times. I'll do it twice. There it comes. Now take one of your threads and jam it through. So now both threads are on one side of the stitch. Like so. Take a pair of scissors. Cut it. Take a lighter. Since this is wax thread, it'll kind of just disintegrate into nothing. Jam it down. Boom. There it is. Now we'll do the same thing for this run. All right, now that we're done with stitching, we can kind of check our work here. And it looks pretty nice. Nice and straight lines here on the back side. Our next step here is to do some edge finishing. So the first step we're going to take is to use this beveling tool to essentially round off these sharp edges. So we'll run it along the length here, taking a chip off of the corners, and then we'll sand, and then we'll apply a burnishing agent, which we'll get to in a minute here. But essentially, we're trying to get to a rounded, smooth edge like that in the end. So we'll start by chamfering the corners, or chamfering the edges. We'll do that run, this run, and then the full perimeter. It takes a little bit of practice. It helps to take a scrap piece of leather and do a test to see how much pressure you want to apply. I'm just going to go by feel here, but feel free to practice before actually doing this on your final piece. I'll try to be as even as I can on each run so that the depth of the chamfer is consistent across each length. They make different sizes of these. Like, for example, this one is much skinnier. So skinny that you can't even bite into the leather, like it just kind of binds on itself. So this is a pretty universal one. I'll leave a link in the description. All right, that looks pretty good. Now, take some sandpaper. This is 120 grit. And we'll just lightly sand away the glue that is dried. And it kind of just helps to even out those 3 layers of leather. Pretty good compared to what we started out with. I'm actually going to try, or start out with a lower grit, aka a grittier piece of sandpaper. So I'm going to start with, this is 80, then I'll go to 120, and then I'll go to 220 and see if that makes my life a little bit easier. This 120 was working, but I think for the first go with the rough stuff, it should be easier to get that down the way I like it with the 80 grit, and then move on to the 120 and then the 220. So let's try this. Yeah, that worked. Certainly not as smooth as the 120, but we'll get there eventually. We'll do the rest of the edges with the 80, then we'll move on to 120. All right, let's move on to 120. Now we'll move on to 220. Pretty smooth. All those layers of leather have kind of melded together nicely between the stacking and the glue, and now the stitching and the burnishing, or sorry, the sanding. Now we will burnish. All right, here's what we'll use to burnish the edges. So this product is called Gum Trigacanth from EcoFlow. And there's a bunch of different burnishing agents out there. I like this one. It's easy to apply. I apply it with canvas. So just a piece of scrap canvas. So we'll rub this on with our finger, and then as it's wet, we'll activate it, kind of stick it on there with this canvas. But this edge finishing description says, a natural gum-based burnishing agent for edge slicking on smooth natural veg tan leathers produces a smooth, professional-looking edge. Or you might have seen other people use this product, this edge slicker, to basically replace this. I have had mixed success with it. I just like using this stuff because I'm experienced with it at this point. But yeah, feel free to use whatever you want. This works for me, so I'm going to stick with it. Here's the before. Just dip your finger in there. Start out adding that much. And I will take this piece of canvas, just kind of rub it in. Kind of rotating the piece as I'm doing that to make sure that I'm getting all parts of the edge. There you go. Helps protect from moisture, gives it a nice smooth finish. We'll keep going around. Pretty good. You can kind of hear the waxy feel to it now. All right, now that the edges are nice and burnished, we will go back outside and apply stain to the areas that have not yet been stained. So those spacer pieces that we never dyed, you can tell there's a layer of lightness there. Also the edges that we beveled, there's a little bit of remaining stuff that we can stain. Also the tops of those, I might take a paintbrush out there to get those details. I've always found edge finishing to be one of the most satisfying pieces of leatherwork. All right, we're looking pretty good here after staining and burnishing. The finishing touch that I like to do to the edges is rub some beeswax on, and then similar to what we did with the burnishing product, rub it in. The friction will melt the wax and add a nice smooth layer of wax onto the edges. So we'll just rub some on here. So you get a layer that looks roughly like that. You don't have to go crazy. Good for waterproofing. Take your canvas, simply rub it in. The end result should be one cohesive edge made up of 3 layers of leather that at this point you can barely tell are 3 layers. I'm kind of doing that rubbing motion on my fingernail underneath the canvas. If you do it on your skin, I found that it might give you a blister, so do it on the nail instead. All right. And what I like to do for the next step is apply this, it's called Carnauba cream protective wax finish straight onto the leather. Just gives it a nice sheen and protective coating. What I'll do first is I'll just give the current finish a rub down. It's kind of residual stain after it had dried. So rub that off. This is just a rag, an old t-shirt. Quick rub. Get all that old stuff off. In preparation for the wax finish. Okay, that's good enough. Now, There are plenty of other finishes out there. The details of which I will not get into here, but this is what I like to use. It's easy to apply, gives it a nice sheen, and it makes the leather feel nice to the touch. Just take a little bit on your rag there and apply it in circles. You can get it on the stitching, no problem. It's not going to hurt it. Tell the difference there. You don't need much. I also like to apply it to the edges over the wax. It just gives it a smoother feel. This product also says to allow to dry, buff to high gloss, and application can be repeated as desired. So I'll consider that dry. I basically just buff it off right after I put it on, which is totally fine. All right. The very last step here is to take a dauber and moisten this stretch right here that will then allow the leather to fold way easier than it currently is able to. So right now this is pretty stiff. Adding a strip of water there will really encourage the fold. So we'll take our dauber we're getting there. Now it wants to stay a little bit more than it did before, which is good. Add a little bit more. Boom. There is your finished card holder. Might even put a rubber band around this, let it sit for a couple hours while it dries. But I'm going to go ahead and test it out. The more you use it, the more patina you'll add to it, the better it'll feel, the better it'll smell. There's our rhino. Yeah, and once this leather stretches a bit, you should be able to add more cards in there. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.